Well, hello there. Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. My name is Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. Today you're listening to part 2 of Is GMO food ever a good thing? Now, last week was part 1, and if you haven't listened, you may want to start with that, because in part 1 I defined a few of the terms and got this ball rolling. Today I'm going to be focusing on genetically engineered fish and animals, and then next week I'll finish this GMO series with edible plants. Before I get into the details of what these agribusinesses are doing, I've got a link for you on the new GMO law, and I'll put it in the show notes. Basically, the labeling of GMOs goes into full throttle effect next January 1st, 2022. Now I'm sending you that PDF, even though I know it's very long and detailed, but maybe some of you want to look for specific details about the law as it may pertain to your interests. The one thing I pulled out of it is that a food would have to be at least 5% genetically engineered, as they're calling it, for the mandatory labeling to be enforced. And I've noticed that some people are complaining that they might stamp the seal that says genetically engineered on a product when only some of the ingredients are genetically engineered or modified. And I know that's a valid concern, but personally, I think I'd like to wait until these labels come out and have a good look at it myself. Oh, by the way, if you have any questions or comments about part 1 or part 2, feel free to email me on my website, Healing Outside the Box, and tap contact at the top. And I also have spots for nutritional consulting or health and wellness coaching. They're slightly different, and I would like to have you jump on board if you're interested in one-on-one counseling or advice. Okay, back to the episode. First of all, scientists have been selectively breeding plants for specific desired traits for quite a long time. We wanted a sweeter corn, so a sweeter corn variety was produced. Up until the 70s, this was basically limited to what nature could produce. In the 1970s, there was a boom in the field of genetic engineering, which now allows us to precisely control what genes are introduced into what plant or animal. Scientists learned back in the 60s that cells can repair their own DNA by recombining the broken pieces and reuniting the DNA. This guy, Martin Gellert from NIH, isolated an enzyme from the bacteria E. coli that is responsible for combining the separate pieces of DNA that normally fixes the broken pieces. They now call this technique recombination gene therapy. The enzyme they isolated is called DNA ligase. So scientists then learned to control this process and chemically modify the genes themselves. As I mentioned in part 1, we can use this technology to, say, increase yields, to strengthen the stalk of the plant so it withstands harsh weather, to resist being eaten by insects, to get a higher protein content, and to manufacture vitamins for fortification. And now, bacteria are being used to manufacture vaccines from their bacterial cells. So, crops, farm animals, fish, and soil bacteria are now some examples of organisms that have been subject to genetic engineering. So the genie is out of the bottle, so to speak. And there's not much chance that we are going to unlearn this new technology. The questions then become, who decides what edible plants will be genetically modified? Who reaps the benefits and why? And how do we prevent unintended consequences? Now, again, I'm only going to scratch the surface, and I'm certainly no expert in genetic engineering, so I'm really venturing out of my comfort zone. I may need to oversimplify certain things a bit so I can get to my point which for me is to put my 2 cents in about maybe where this is going and what we should be looking for. Okay, first of all, not all plant seeds make baby plants the same way. Some crops are self-pollinators. Soybeans and cotton are example of self-pollinating plants. This means they do not need the help of honeybees or the wind to germinate seeds. So technically, farmers could save their soybean seeds every year and plant the same seed the following year. But here's what happened. Once Monsanto made a GMO seed to withstand Roundup, Monsanto patented that seed and made farmers sign a contract that forces them to buy Monsanto seeds and the Roundup weed killer every single year. That's the problem. Now, other plants are called outcrossers. They need to rely on honeybees or the wind to spread the pollen. These are corn, alfalfa, canola, and fruits. So these plants need genetic diversity, or the next year's crop will be weaker. And that's what a lot of scientists are concerned about. Most fruits and vegetables will fall into this category. Now, these crops also can be separated into 2 types: open-pollinated and hybrid. Open-pollinated crops are old-fashioned crops that our grandparents and parents grew, including heirloom tomatoes. I remember as a child we had a little patch for vegetables in the backyard, and my father grew those heirloom tomatoes. We were in charge of picking off the green tomato worms and stomping them on the ground. But I have a very specific memory of my mom asking me to go grab some tomatoes for dinner, and I pulled the heirloom tomatoes off of the vine and brought them in, and we ate them, and they were so sweet and delicious. I know it's not possible for all kids to have that experience, but I haven't given up on schoolyard gardens yet. Now, if my father or farmers growing those heirloom crops decide to pull out some seeds from one of those tomatoes, it will come true the next year, meaning it will look pretty much like the plant the previous year did. Hybrid seeds, however, are a cross of 2 pure lines, sometimes inbred lines that by themselves would do somewhat poorly. But when crossed with another line, the offspring gets a boost from what they call hybrid vigor and outshines the parents. So what you get are inbred lines that think they're purebreds. They're kind of like the royal family in that way. So individual farmers theoretically could choose what works for them. But the hybrid seeds will need to be purchased yearly for the best yields. Once they genetically modify these hybrids, it will be difficult or nearly impossible to go back to the pure seed. Perhaps which is why there are stocks of pure seeds hidden somewhere underground, hopefully not with the nuclear waste. Now, last week I misspoke when I was discussing whether Monsanto is using sterile seeds or not. Scientists have now successfully been able to make plants with seeds that are sterile and cannot be planted. Monsanto has that technology, but the NIH does as well. Presently, Monsanto has been banned from selling those seeds, but instead what they're doing is that they're patenting the genetically modified seed, then they're making the farmers sign a contract stating that they will not use those seeds or another manufacturer's seeds the following year. So the problem is a legal one. The double whammy is that farmers have to buy Monsanto's Roundup with the genetically modified seeds. In Monsanto, and some similar agribusinesses that patent and then allow only the sale of seeds from them, are creating a potential lack of diversity nightmare. For this and so many other reasons, we need regulation with documentation as to who is allowed to genetically modify our food. And perhaps we should revisit the question about whether or not profit-making corporations should be allowed to genetically modify and patent our food supply. If we manage to get our food supply totally messed up, who's in charge of stopping that runaway gravy train. There are countries in Europe that are on both sides of this GMO issue. Someone did a survey of individuals in the EU and found that some people were okay with GMO plants, provided that farmers would not be forced out of business by corporations. But the idea of genetically modifying animals gave people the heebie-jeebies. Okay, so there may be a few good reasons to worry about genetically modified animals. Number 1, animals and fish have been genetically engineered to grow faster and larger or to have decreased susceptibility to disease. Here's what they do. They insert, say, growth hormone into the salmon, resulting in faster growth in the eggs that the salmon then lays. However, researchers studied genetically modified fish released into wild populations of the same species way back in 1999. The new transplanted gene may actually threaten the viability of both the genetically modified fish and the wild fish. I'm not sure if researchers fully understand why both groups of fish did poorly in future generations. Number 2, genetically modified fish and animals have been used to grow tissues and human transplant organs. This is called xenotransplantation. When I read this, I had this thought popping up in my head. How far are we going to take this, given the fact that we already have a poor track record of abusing our farm animals? And yes, I understand that we kill farm animals and eat them, but are we okay with inhumanely raising farm animals just to kill them and take out their gallbladder once ours is shot? And if there is one person out there thinking male horse body parts, then that would be one too many. Number 3, as I mentioned in part 1, cattle have been genetically modified to exhibit resistance to mad cow disease. And researchers, of course, are familiar with the theory that mad cow disease became a problem when we decided to grind up cattle carcasses and feed them back to the cattle for really cheap cattle feed. I'm sure they were thinking at the time, what could possibly go wrong? Number 4, genetically modified animals have been bred to carry human genes, both normal and mutated or diseased. They then can study the progression of various diseases. On the pro side of this argument, they may be able to find treatments for genetic diseases. And certainly, nutrition pathology research into what foods may or may not cause cancer has been done in laboratory mice and rats for decades. But do we feel comfortable doing this to pigs or dogs without any regulations? Number 5, there will be people for either religious or ethical reasons that feel we don't have the right to, as they might say, play God and tamper with nature. Perhaps making a plant to repel insects is on a whole different level than, say, inserting animal genes into plants or vice versa. These people have called for clear GMO labeling laws, which thankfully is now happening. Number 6, another concern associated with GMOs is that private companies will claim ownership of the modified animals that they've created and not share them at a reasonable cost. If these claims are correct, it is argued that the use of genetically modified crops and animals will hurt the economy and the environment. Monoculture practices by large-scale farm production of both crops and animals will dominate over the diversity contributed by small farmers. In last week's episode, I brought up the experiments with genetically modifying the skin color of glowfish, and I'll put this reference in the show notes. Currently, glowfish are the only recombinant DNA animal that has been approved for human use by the FDA. The FDA approved it basically because the patent appears to be with non-edible fish, such as glowfish tetras or zebrafish for fish tanks. Glowfish, by the way, is a brand that breeds genetically modified fish. Then they patent this genetic modification, so then it becomes illegal to breed and sell these GMO fish. This approval has raised an important question about whether and to what extent genetically modified animals should be available to consumers. Now, the purpose of lightening the skin color of this glowfish was originally so they could look inside the fish for signs of environmental damage, such as exposure to toxins. But these fish became popular for fish tanks because of their beautiful bright colors. They inserted genes from, say, coral into the eggs of a zebrafish. So, scientists are now able to genetically change the skin color of the offspring of animals. And we are, in fact, animals as well. That brings up all kinds of ethical consideration. Again, where do we draw the line? And who decides that? Number 7. We can now genetically modify chickens or other animals to insert human genes in order to, say, test for a potentially lethal virus. Now, what could possibly go wrong there? So, this could potentially produce life-saving research techniques or possibly produce the next pandemic. Now, I've got a lot of material to cover on edible plants, so I'm going to stop here for now and continue with the plants next week. All of this is to say that, once again, we are not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle. But at the very least, I think most of us can agree that we need more regulation and more insight into the possible unintended consequences. For example, when we add something like human growth hormone to an edible fish, what else can happen? Cancer, maybe? We don't know. I think it's only a matter of time before people catch on to this following fact. Some people are genetically prone to eat more and not gain as much weight as the rest of us poor schmucks. Yeah, I bet that people will be lining up to get injected with that skinny gene. But what would be the unintended consequences of that? I don't know, and I do this for a living. Obviously, we are not going to solve this overnight, but I think it helps to be aware that these changes are going on now, and if we educate ourselves, we don't have to feel like all of this just got sprung on us. If you'd like to get involved in this dialogue or ask any questions, again, feel free to email me on my contact page, Healing Outside the Box, and then tap Contact at the top. That's all I have for you today. Be well, and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.